The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at cem.mtsu.edu.
I have the great privilege and honor of also introducing one of my dear friends and colleagues, Dr. Modelº Gillis. Better than me, she's a certified academic language therapist. I'm just a practitioner who became interested in reading while at the University of Connecticut, where she studied with Isabel Lieberman. If anybody knows who that is a huge icon in the world of literacy development and phonological processing in particular. In 2009, Margie founded Literacy How Incorporated, a nonprofit organization to provide professional development opportunities for teachers on how best to implement research-based reading practices in the classroom. Margie and I have worked a long time in leadership positions for various organizations, and most recently we were down in New Orleans together having lunch, and before that we were shaking our tushes to Love Shack. So I can't wait to hear what she has to say, and she's laughing, which I knew that she would laugh and get a kick out of that. So without further ado, Dr. Modelº Gillis, and there will be no Love Shack in this presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for hanging in. It's been a long day, but an amazingly exciting day filled with new knowledge and information. I want to thank Tim for inviting me to come. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but one day I hope to be able to attend. And also just for the sponsors and MTSU folks that have been supporting the technology today, and also really want to thank Louisa and Louise, my esteemed colleagues, for teeing up this presentation so nicely. And last but not least, I want to thank my team, many of whom are probably listening, and I could not do what I do without an amazing group of passionate, smart, knowledgeable, experienced people. It's hard work, but it's great work. So thank you to all of you. So one teacher at a time, supporting teachers' knowledge of the science of reading. Just to give you a little bit of background about Literacy How, our mission is to empower teachers. And certainly Louisa and Louise both talked about how important this teacher knowledge is and presented lots of data about that point. We believe that teachers, not programs, teach children to read, and that has certainly been highlighted today in all three sessions, that programs are important, but teachers' knowledge is really the most important variable. And we know that 95% of our kids can learn to read, and that's our goal. So today for our objectives, I'm going to talk about why we believe teachers need to have coaching support and present a little bit of research on what teachers need to know and be able to do, although certainly Louisa and Louise did a fantastic job of that, so I don't really need to spend too much time on that point. Also, what our research is telling us their current knowledge is. And I'm going to spend most of my time this afternoon talking specifically about how we coach teachers, explaining a little bit about cognitive coaching and why that's the method that we use when we work with teachers, because it does build their knowledge and their use of evidence-based practices. And I'm going to share a few of our tools just so you can see some of the things that we use, pacing guides, etc., literacy protocols. And then I'll spend some time talking about what we coach. And again, Louisa and Louise really spent a great deal of time talking about the content of structured literacy. So I don't have to do a lot of the specific content. They did such a fabulous job with that. Again, really focusing on the science of teaching reading. I do want to say, just before I get too far down the road, that the work that we've been doing for the past 20 years has supported teachers primarily in Tier 1, so general education classroom teachers, because we believe strongly, and I'm sure most of you agree, that if we don't get Tier 1 right, we have too many curriculum casualties who need Tier 2 and Tier 3 instruction. So that's been the primary focus. However, having said that, in the last few years, we have done more coaching around structured literacy. And in this case, our structured literacy content is really provided for all teachers in all tiers of instruction. And how we coach them depends on the role that they play in those tiers and the students that they work with. So I'll talk more about that as we go. So I'd hope that by the end of this talk, you'll understand why, and I think you already know why teachers need to know the science of reading based on our prior talks. And with a primary focus this afternoon on how we coach teachers so they can apply the science that you heard so much about, and to learn a little bit about the focus of our coaching. And I'm going to start with this framework based on the golden circle. Some of you may have seen Simon Sinek's YouTube video. And if you haven't, I think it's worth spending 10 minutes watching it, because it orients, I think, the listener to why we're doing what we're doing and having that be at the heart of explaining our coaching model. And followed by how we do what we do, followed by what we actually do. And sometimes those three circles are talked about in reverse order, starting with what, how, and then getting to the why. I'm going to just talk for a few minutes about the why. Why does literacy how exist? Well, I mentioned this a minute ago. 95% of children can be taught to read. So we have to use that as our benchmark, as our goal, as our expectation when we teach children. However, 65% of the nation's fourth graders are reading below grade level based on NAEP data. And why is that? We believe, and certainly you've heard and seen lots of evidence today, that teachers are typically not taught how to teach reading. There's a whole lot of research to support that principle and that fact. And yet, teacher knowledge of effective literacy instruction strategies can override student disadvantages. And that's what we really want to focus on today. We know that when teachers know the science of reading and know how to apply that knowledge, that they actually can close the gap. And that's our primary goal in the work that we do. Now I'm showing you this slide of the most recent NAEP scores from 2019. And you'll see that the nation scores are the circles that you see starting in 1992, and you can see the trend line across through to 2019. And then the crosses are actually Tennessee's fourth grade scores. And you can see that they're quite similar to the nation's. There's some statistically significant differences. Tennessee actually stayed the same in their scores, in their raw scores, from 2017, the last time the NAEP was administered, till 2019, where the US scores, nation scores went down. You can also want you to look at, this is the line that shows the proficient levels that are expected. And by proficient, we're talking about grade level. Advanced scores would be above grade level. So you can see that the nation as a whole, Tennessee, and all states for that matter, are below that proficient line. So I think we all agree there's a lot of reasons why we should be doing this work with teachers. I want to talk about how we do this work with teachers. And I want to show a very important slide that depicts what the professional development outcomes are for the various professional development elements that you see in the left-hand column. So there are 4 elements that this slide is specifically focused on. The first is teaching theory. We know is really important based on the information that was presented today by our prior speakers. We also can acknowledge that demonstrating within professional development workshops some of the methods would be helpful, and that when you have demonstration, the knowledge level actually goes up to about 30%. Just talking about knowledge here now. When you practice as a participant, and Louisa did a nice job today of having you practice some things with the phonetic alphabet, you can get to 60% attainment of knowledge. And with some coaching support, you actually can get to a level of 95%. That's just for knowledge, as is seen here. If we're looking at attaining skill in actually conveying that knowledge, you can see that the coaching matters greatly here. Theory drops, demonstration drops, because you have to do more to actually attain the skill and translate, right? But here's what we really want to focus on in this slide, that in order to get to transfer to practice, meaning that I actually know how to teach this so well that I can ensure that my students' outcomes are going to reflect that knowledge, that skill, and that transfer. Look at what happens to theory, demonstration, and practice. You only get to that transfer with substantive coaching support. And I use this slide all the time when I talk about the model that we use in our work, because that coaching is really what's going to make the transfer possible. In addition to that coaching, we have to encourage and incentivize our teachers to practice, because Joyce and Shower's research also substantiates the fact that teachers need to practice things 20 to 25 times before that becomes natural and intuitive and habitual. Now, Louisa showed this great slide in her presentation earlier, showing that knowledge does matter. And there's, again, lots of substantive studies and information showing the importance of coaching, supporting that teacher knowledge factor and variable. And another great resource on coaching was written by Mike McKenna and Sharon Walpole in 2013, talking about the challenges associated with coaching teachers. And I like this definition, talking about coaching as a strategy for implementing professional support system for teachers. And it's this system that includes, as we saw in that prior slide, the researcher theory, the demonstration, practice, and what's really important here is the feedback that we as the experts can provide for teachers to understand when they're on the right track and when they need to course correct. So I want to take a minute and just talk a little bit about our mentors. I have an amazing team, as I mentioned before, and this team of mentors, really, we work together very closely to hone our skills in working with adult learners. And what our core principle points to is that we want to help our teachers think through their instructional practices. They don't have a lot of time during the day, and we all know this, those of you who are teachers, and I applaud the work that you do. I understand that you don't get a lot of think time during the day. You are really on, a treadmill most of the day, trying to keep your students engaged, giving them material that's going to be differentiated for where they are and what their needs are. When do you have time to actually think? So what we're trying to promote in the work that we do with teachers is to support what is the process that you all have to go through in order to select the methods of instruction, the techniques that you're going to use, and the activities that you're going to employ to get the job done. So our mentors have to be knowledgeable about the science of reading. That's first and foremost. They have to also have expertise in working with readers of all kinds, but particularly struggling readers, because I think that's where you really learn how to be most effective when you have children who are really struggling with various aspects of reading. In addition, our mentors are very skilled in both designing and delivering professional development. Again, professional development that is engaging, that's interesting for teachers to learn about, that feels positive and supportive. And in addition, they have to be informed about core reading programs and how to integrate these practices and supplemental materials. And I want to take just a minute to talk about that, because Louisa, actually, both Louisa and Louise talked about the importance of good materials. And in our state, we have some districts that have a core reading program, but many that don't. Many of our districts use a guided reading approach versus a scripted program. And there are pros and cons, of course, to both, but our mentors really have to be very flexible in terms of helping teachers, depending on what they're using to teach reading. And last but not least, they really have to have expertise in working with adult learners, and that's where this cognitive coaching comes into play. You know, it's not enough to have had experience teaching children. Adult learners are quite different in how we learn new material, how we process information, etc. So this is another area of expertise that our mentors all have. And then this is extremely important. I think it's also important for our teachers that we have to be lifelong learners, knowing that maybe what we believed yesterday or last week or last year worked then, but now there's a new research study that shows, oh my goodness, what we were doing before isn't exactly right. Well, we have to be willing to change that. That's important, that open-mindedness. And this attitude of respect for the profession is incredibly important. We really cannot abide by teacher bashing, which happens all too frequently. We have such a great deal of respect for the teaching profession and the teachers who give selflessly every day to support their students' learning. So when we work with our schools and we contract with schools and districts for a year at a time, and if we're fortunate for 3 years, 5 years, we've been working with some districts more than 10 or 15 years. When we walk into the school to work with them over the course of a year, we have to have a clearly articulated job description. Everyone on staff needs to know why we're there and what the purpose of our work is. And so in this case, we're making it very clear that we'll be there to model our lessons for them, to support teachers in the implementation of these methods that we believe are based on the science of reading, or I shouldn't say believe, that we know are based on the science of reading. And we use a gradual release method, which I'll talk about in a minute a little bit more. We also ask for, as much as we can, monthly workshops so that we have time with teachers outside of their classrooms. Again, so that we can really support their knowledge of the theory. Some teachers really are not keen to learn the theory, but eventually we, I think, motivate them to want to know that, and it certainly makes a difference when they understand the theory behind the practice. We also spend a great deal of time supporting teachers in not only the collection of data, but the analysis of data. We don't always have, have say in what assessments are used, particularly if they're universal screeners. But what we often do have some influence over are the diagnostic data that are administered to dig deeper. And also we spend a great deal of time helping teachers analyze the data so they can understand what those data are telling them. Not just the numbers, but looking at student work. And Louisa showed some wonderful examples of student spelling. Those spelling errors are very, very wonderful for pointing to what's driving the reading and spelling difficulties that we see in some students. It's also important because those data are going to help us differentiate the instruction. And we know from lots of research that most of the interventions that we must use, especially with kids who struggle, has to be differentiated into data-driven, grouping arrangements for the optimum results. We also meet with grade level teams because a lot of this data analysis is done during grade level meeting time. We also have a relationship with the principal in that we want and know that they have to support the work we're doing with teachers. And again, we hope that if we asked anybody on staff in the school, why are we here? What is the purpose of the work? That they could answer that. Again, that's not always in our control, but if we have a good relationship with the building administrator, we hope that that information gets disseminated. It's really important. And speaking of the administrator, we acknowledge the importance of that person's role in the work that we do. Certainly in the school, we hope that they are a strong instructional leader. That may or may not be the case. Unfortunately, some of our administrators are former secondary PE teachers or science teachers who don't necessarily know the science of reading. So that's, that can be an obstacle. But either way, we need to meet with this administrator to help them understand how we can support them. Meeting with the staff, as I said before, to explain what our coaching model is. And I should also say here that in a school, let's say K-5 school, which is usually what we have who we're working with, that's 6 grade levels, anywhere from 2 to 4 teachers per grade level. That's the average grade size. And in terms of numbers of teachers, that's anywhere from 12 to 20 to 30 teachers. It's too many teachers for us to coach in 1 year. So we're coaching a small group of teachers, usually by grade level, and I'll speak more about that. But again, if the entire staff understands what it is that we're doing in the school, that will be helpful down the road. Having these meetings with the staff for discussion, again, to explain what we're doing there. Another important point is that if we have an opportunity to work with someone internal in the school, and we call that internal person a teacher specialist, they might be the literacy coach if the school has one. They could be a reading interventionist. They could be a reading specialist. It varies from school to school, but it's really important for us in order to sustain the work that we do, to build capacity, to have someone in the school that we can work, directly with. And then just having time to meet with the mentor, for us, the mentor to meet with the staff for introductions. And as I mentioned before, providing release time both for professional development and data team meetings is also essential in the work that we do. So this administrator makes all of these things happen. That's the point of this slide. And last but not least, if possible, that administrator can and should attend some of our professional development because, as I mentioned earlier, they may not know much about literacy. And the more they know, the better those teachers will be supported. And they can also be looking for some of the things we're teaching teachers about when they go into classrooms for their look-fors or their walkthroughs. I also want to take a minute and just talk a little bit about our professional development. And I'm calling it embedded because it really is in the classroom with the teacher. And we're going to be translating the science of reading that you've heard lots about today into professional development workshops and classroom practices. We're going to use the student data, as I mentioned before, and we're going to ultimately create these method-proof teachers who can weigh the merits of the latest reading research, use the programs they're given optimally, and also select materials that really will help get the job done. In addition, we are going to tailor our professional development to meet the needs of our individual schools because every school is different. As I mentioned earlier, some schools have core reading programs. Some of those core reading programs are good and some of them are not so good. Some are based on the research, many are not. So we have no control over that, unfortunately. But what we can do is support teachers in knowing how to use those materials most effectively and where needed and when needed to supplement what the school is using, the curricula the school is using. We also use these scope and sequences. I'll show you a snapshot of one in a minute with clear curricular goals that will guide the delivery of reading instruction across the grade levels. And again, both Louisa and Louise spoke about the importance of these roadmaps. Here's a little snapshot of one. Some people call these pacing guides. Some people call them scope and sequences. Some people call them curriculum maps. Basically, what you see here is just a very, very specific page of a multi-page document that lays out what is going to be taught kindergarten, first, second, all the way up through the grade levels. Our scope and sequence documents actually start in pre-K and go all the way up through fifth grade. I will say that we are also working in some middle and high schools as well. I just want to reiterate a few things that I've said, but maybe a couple I haven't. There are 5 features of effective PD according to this particular study cited here. One is focusing on content, which I think we've talked a lot about today. One is to make sure that teachers are actively learning, because all of us need to be engaged in our learning or it's not going to stick. So these are some of those elements. We also focus on coherence, and this is a very important piece of the puzzle. If a district and or school are using a very different approach to literacy, or if they have a different goal for the year that's not aligned to the work that we're doing, or in some cases, they might be adopting a new core reading program and the teacher's focus is on implementing a program with fidelity, then it's going to be much harder for us to do our work because we don't have that coherence and alignment and single-minded focus that really will help us get our work done more effectively. Fourth, we need to be with teachers over a period of time, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But teachers, in many cases, teachers have coaches embedded in their schools, but they might only see them for, 10 minutes every 3 or 4 weeks. And in many cases, the coach is there to collect data or to drop off some materials or whatever the case may be. It's not necessarily the sustained professional development that I'm talking about. This for sustained duration, very intensive, from week to week, month to month, through over the course of not just 1 year, but beyond a year. And lastly, collective participation. So I think that I talked a little bit about the importance of getting teachers all together from the grade levels to participate in a professional learning community that builds this model across grade levels throughout the school. Jan Hasbrook also wrote a great book on coaching, and I just heard from her yesterday, as a matter of fact, and she is revising that book. But she's focused on this whole idea of student-focused coaching, and some of her best practices are that teachers must agree to be coached, that coaches are peers, and this is extremely important as well. They're not supervisors, they're not evaluators. We cannot be seen that way, or teachers will not trust us or engage with us in substantive ways. And as I said here, just establishing a trusting and respectful relationship. And that's really what our work focuses on. I mentioned this gradual release. Most of you are familiar with this, but this begins where mentors will model lessons for the teacher in their classroom with those teachers or with that teacher's students. We then gradually release so that the teacher teaches with us. So there's a team teaching or co-teaching approach. And eventually we gradually or all the way release so that the teacher does the lesson so we can provide the feedback that they need. And this cycles through the year as new learning is taking place. So we'll delve into a topic, a specific aspect of phonemic awareness, for example, and we'll cycle through this gradual release until teachers are comfortable taking the reins. And the cognitive coaching cycle is also part of our process. So in a cycle, in an average cycle, we're looking at 60 to 90 minutes. I know that's, in some cases, that's extremely optimistic. We take what we can. It may be 40 minutes because of time constraints. But within that coaching cycle, we have a planning conference where we talk about our goals for the lesson, what evidence we used to select that particular lesson, the strategies that we're going to be using during the lesson, and how we're going to assess our results or the efficacy of that lesson. The second part of the cycle is when we're actually doing the lesson, and if teachers are watching us model a lesson, we're asking them to gather evidence about the efficacy of that lesson, whether it's looking at specific students while they're working or looking at assessment results or work samples, and also documenting what strategies we've used. So we'll be handing them a lesson plan that they'll be observing, and they can actually sort of highlight the things that they saw during that lesson. And the third extremely important part of this coaching cycle is what we call the reflection conference. And this is when we have one-on-one time with the teacher. Again, this is ideal. We have to modify this. Sometimes we do a lesson for a grade level team, in which case the reflection conference might be with all of those first grade or second grade teachers. The point, though, is to give them time to ask questions about what they saw as evidence for whether or not it was an effective lesson. They can ask questions about what they saw. And we then will say, okay, next step for next week or the week after is to go with the next step in the process. So again, this is an iterative cycle and occurs in different ways over the course of the year that we work with the teachers. Another thing that is incorporated into the work that we do is to help schools with their literacy plans. And this may or may not happen explicitly. It all depends on the role that we have in the school. But ideally, before we even enter the school, we conduct what we call a needs assessment. I'm going to show you a screenshot in a minute of a great resource that you all can look at and use in your schools, especially if you are coaches or administrators. But we do want to know what's happening in the school, what's currently being used for assessment, what's currently being used for teaching reading, et cetera. And so these data that are part of the needs assessment will help us support the development of a literacy plan. Then we will meet with the principal to discuss the results of this needs assessment. And of course, the principal, the coach, and key teacher leaders are involved in helping us develop and get the results for this needs assessment. And then we'll use that as part of the process for identifying the teachers and the grade levels to be engaged in this coaching work. So who's going to receive the coaching support for the year, and what is the content focus going to be? And as I said, identifying the teachers who are going to receive the coaching, and some will receive some support beforehand. Ideally, if we can get teachers to engage in professional development to sort of prime the pump, if you will, get them ready to be coached and give them some experience and build background knowledge, that's actually really, really ideal. something we've been doing in one particular district for a couple of years. And then we're going to map out the schedule for the year, including when we're going to deliver our professional development workshops, when the data team meetings will occur, grade level teams, et cetera. This is the screenshot of the literacy scan that I mentioned. And if you go to literacyscan.org and scroll down to the bottom of the page, you'll see tools and resources that I think you'll find extremely helpful. This scan was developed with support from the Grossman Family Foundation. And we've used this in the work that we've done with the Connecticut Literacy Model. So the Connecticut Association of Schools, Literacy How, and Hill for Literacy collaborated on this district literacy scan. So what I want to talk for a minute about is that we've divided our content up into phases. At first, we would call these years. So we would have year 1 and year 2. And then we decided that's, we wanted to call it a phase versus a year, because a phase could happen over the course of 6 months or could take a year and a half. A lot really does depend on where the schools are and how much time that we are given with teachers, et cetera. So let me just explain what phase 1 would look like. So as I said before, the principal and the Literacy How mentor meet with the teachers to discuss the model and what the school plan is going to be for the work. We plan and implement the data process. And so I haven't really spoken specifically today about RTI, but that is certainly the framework that we use in all the work that we do. I mentioned that we have historically, since 2000, been working primarily with general education classroom teachers, so tier 1, but we also have encouraged principals and administrators to work with us and include us in their data process and in their RTI process. In the course of doing that, as you all would imagine, we interact with reading specialists, reading interventionists, special education teachers. Because if we're just a standalone tier 1 coaching piece, then we don't build that alignment and that coherence within the school. And I think you all can appreciate it's hard to build that alignment and coherence, but without it, we don't have the same impact and we can't sustain the model as effectively. Again, we meet weekly with administrators and or the point person. The person I referred to earlier is the teacher specialist or internal person, partnering with them to build capacity. We deliver monthly PD workshops if we can. We'll take whatever time we're given. Sometimes it's before school. Sometimes it's during the teacher's prep time. Occasionally we're asked, not occasionally, probably more than occasionally, we're asked to do this after school. We try to be as flexible as we possibly can be because we know there are so many constraints out of our control. We engage in these coaching sessions that I just described, following that gradual release and using the cognitive coaching cycle, especially making sure that we have planning time before the actual lessons and reflection time after the actual lessons. And in phase 1, we're going to focus on foundational skills. And those foundational skills include phonemic and phonological awareness and code that always emphasize meaning. So while we're going to say that that is a focus, those PA and code skills, that does not mean that we're not really heavily emphasizing meaning, vocabulary, and comprehension. That should always be at the center. Phase 2 looks similar to phase 1 in that we're use the data. I guess starting phase 2, we're going to use data to update the plan. And just as we did in phase 1, we're going to meet with teachers and talk about our model, our school literacy plan. We're going to continue to implement our data and RTI process, meeting weekly with the administrator and the point person or point person, partnering with the internal coach, delivering our workshops, engaging in our coaching sessions. But in phase 2, we're going to shift our focus from the foundational skills to comprehension, and comprehension broadly speaking, including vocabulary, syntax, text comprehension, and written expression. Now, I want to talk about the what. So I've just described how we coach, our cognitive coaching model, and why we believe that is really the most substantive way to ensure that teachers can actually transfer what they know to practice and ultimately to get the student outcomes we're looking for. But what is it that we actually are coaching? And I'm showing this slide that Louisa showed you this morning, what's in Powerful PD. And just to reiterate some of the things she talked about, these scientifically sound models of how we learn to read. Everything we do is based on that science. Having roadmaps, one of which I just showed you a little snapshot of that scope and sequence, talking about with teachers, what is the structure of the English language at all levels, at the preschool level, at the early elementary level, and what are all those levels of attainment. We do use Jean Charles' stages of reading development as a framework, and talk about those different stages in terms of reading acquisition. And then lastly, modeling structured literacy lessons so that teachers have a model to look at so that they can then practice to automaticity. Another slide she showed was that the teacher knowledge is very important, but that the instructional methods are also very important. So we really emphasize both. Knowing teachers need those instructional models, need good curricula and materials. I do want to show you a snapshot from the Tennessee Early Literacy Supports Framework that acknowledge these 5 components of the early literacy work. And all of these are things that I think we've talked about today. I just want to show you where they fit in. Actually, before I leave this slide, I will say that we didn't talk too much about family engagement. Family engagement is one of our goals in the Connecticut literacy model that I helped develop. And family engagement is extremely important, something that I've found over the years to be important but difficult to do well. So I don't want to leave without explaining how important that is as well. And in the work that we've done with families, we've actually used parent leadership training people, PLTI, that's a professional development initiative that started in Connecticut about 20 years ago with the Commission on Children. And we've used these folks who are trained in this methodology. They're not teachers, but they've been trained to interact with parents and caregivers. And we've had great success with those folks, teaching them about literacy and engaging families in very, I think, important ways so that they can help their children at home. So this is a picture of a reading wheel that we developed to show, first and foremost, the complexity of reading with oral language at the core. And you see the 5 sections of the wheel that depict the core components of comprehensive literacy. Fluency was taken out of the wheel a number of years ago and replaced with syntax for, I believe, some very good reasons. Fluency is important, but certainly not, we don't treat it the same way we do phonemic awareness, phonics, and the other components. And we build teacher knowledge in all those content areas so they can help their students. We focus on oral language at the core because while the National Reading Panel talked about 5 big ideas that I think most teachers are familiar with, the oral language was not explicitly discussed in that report. So we spend a lot of time building teachers' knowledge about oral language, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. So this teacher knowledge is extremely important, as I said, and that knowledge has to include both pedagogical knowledge, how they implement this content knowledge with students, and applying that knowledge, right? So they're understanding the fundamental competencies that need to be mastered in order to learn to read and write proficiently. And again, we build those fundamental competencies with teachers through this gradual release. Building their knowledge, helping them learn how to put that knowledge into practice and implement that knowledge. So it's that knowledge and practice, and then this planning. So you see this unicyclist holding a map. That map is really, really important for planning purposes and knowing where their students are and where they need to go. So knowledge, practice, and planning. Now, before I explain a little bit more and show you an exciting model that I'm really looking forward to sharing with all of you, I just want to say a few words about this idea of the language constraint on writing systems that Chuck Perfetti talked about in his research, specifically this piece that he wrote in 2003. Writing systems encode spoken language, and Louisa and Louise both talked about that important principle. Spoken language can encode meaning, but writing systems do not, so they're not parallel systems. Learning how to read actually has to involve learning how our writing system, in this case, an alphabetic one, and certainly a difficult one. You heard a lot about English's orthography today, and it's a very opaque, deep orthography that must be learned over many years. And how we learn to read has to involve learning how that orthographic system actually encodes our spoken language. And I think this is important to understand that while the goal of reading is to obtain meaning, and no one on this call or on this, this conference or involved in this conference today would argue the goal of reading is to obtain meaning, but the goal of something is not the same as its essential nature. I think that's a really important point that we have to keep reminding ourselves about. Why do we have to know about the English orthography to teach children to read? I hope all of you today understand more deeply why that's important. And in order to illustrate that, I'm excited to be able to explain this model, the acquisition of language and literacy, what the Literacy How mentors fondly refer to as the all model. And before I describe this to you all, I want to just thank Dr. Caitlin Dillon, who is a Literacy How mentor, a brilliant woman who actually conceived this model. And I hope it will help explain the complexity of reading in a way that shows the relationships here. So the ability to read and write well depends on the development of all the components and connections that you see here. So I'm going to try to walk you through this. When we're able to go from the bottom, I hope you can see my cursor on the left-hand side of the slide. When we're able to go from the bottom to the top, right, from written symbols through spoken language to these mental representations, we are able to read. So reading involves going from looking at these symbols to what they represent in spoken language to what the language represents in terms of meaning, or a picture in the reader's mind that's made up of these mental representations. When we're able to go from the top to the bottom, from a picture or an idea in our minds made up of these mental representations through spoken language to these written symbols, we are able to write. So on the right side of the slide, you see writing, right? Bottom up reading, top down writing. Writing involves going from these mental representations, pictures, ideas, stories that are in our minds, to the words that mean those ideas in spoken language, to these written symbols that are used to write the words. The top components, right, and connections are related to meaning. So the meaning connections, all right, you can think of them as comp. We have listening comprehension, and speaking is composition. So composing one's thought using language. Comprehension and comprehension then, right? Comprehension and composition can be thought of as comp. And then look at the bottom components and the connections that have to do with getting words off the page, right? So we have getting the words off the page or decoding, and getting the words onto the page or encoding. So these two processes have to do with the code, the way that written symbols are used to represent spoken language. So together, these can be referred to as code skills. Now, what happens in the brain of a reader? And Louisa talked about this earlier. Stanislas Dehaene talks about what is happening when spoken language is being processed. And in order to become a reader, we have to use those areas of the brain that are really dedicated for language acquisition, for literacy acquisition. So brilliant Dr. Dillon showed how we could take this model and turn this and embed it over the left hemisphere, the language hemisphere, where you see mental representations, spoken language here in the temporal lobe, and the occipital temporal lobe, where written symbols are processed. So what I hope that you as teachers can appreciate in this model is that you as teachers are changing your students' brains. You are helping them to build a neurocircuitry that is going to be most effective, optimum for becoming fluent readers. And you're doing that by understanding the relationship between those components that I just talked about and the connections. And this is just a slide that depicts the pre-intervention brain. This is the left hemisphere. Frontal lobes are being activated, but the temporal parietal and occipital temporal regions are not, okay? But when you have an intervention that includes all the wonderful things that Louisa and Louise talked about so eloquently today, all those pieces contribute to an intervention that is going to change the wiring for that child who would otherwise be illiterate and unable to access content and be successful in life for that matter. Another thing that you've heard a lot about today was the simple view of reading. And the simple view of reading is this equation. Listening comprehension times decoding is equals reading comprehension. We can change the order, decoding times listening comprehension, right? Because in a multiplication problem, you can change the order and doesn't change the product. And let's flip this again to look at this in relationship to the framework that we just talked about. So you have the decoding here, you have the listening comprehension here. And when all of these components and connections are woven together, as Hollis Scarborough showed us, her rope depicts, you have skilled, fluent reading with great outcomes for kids. Now, going back to the reading wheel that I showed you a few minutes ago, I just want to take this apart a little bit more to explain how our teachers are engaged in all of this content in a way that actually ensures that they master a great deal of information, both at a knowledge and theoretical level, but most importantly, at an application level. So I'm a big fan of tables showing how things align. In the left-hand column, you see the 5 big ideas of from the National Reading Panel. In the next column, you see the reading wheel that includes those big ideas, but has a few things added. Spelling, and I think you all appreciate, if you've been listening today, why spelling is super, super important. It's reciprocal to decoding. We replaced fluency with syntax, and that's a conversation for another day, but I bet some of you can understand why. We included morphology here in the vocabulary section of the wheel. And we also included written expression with comprehension because those are reciprocal skills as well, very much related, and they complement each other. And then we added oral language at the core. And again, looking and thinking back to that all model where we had spoken language in the middle, we know that that is a very central component to learning how to read and write proficiently. I just want you to also see where all of that fits in with the Common Core State Standards, which I think many of you as listeners have those Common Core Standards in your districts that you're meant to align your teaching to. And lastly, because we've devoted this day to structured literacy, I want to just show the alignment, right, between the elements of structured literacy and where they fit in to all these other models. Again, I wanted to just bring us back to what's happening in Tennessee. I hope the legislation, I was told today that the legislation might be at risk currently because of our current crisis in the country. I hope that it will be alive and well after this is behind us, this national crisis is behind us. But I just want to point out, some of the elements that have been highlighted in that legislation. And I want to show a few more things that we've used in the work that we've done. We talked a lot about phonological awareness today. And phonological awareness is extremely important in learning how to read. And it's something that, unfortunately, our teachers still don't know as well as they need to know and understand this progression, this hierarchy that starts with phonological awareness, right, on the oral language launchpad, but has several levels that lead up to full phoneme awareness. And so we want especially preschool and kindergarten teachers to understand that progression in order to maximize their teaching, especially with the children who are most at risk. I also want to share another activity. Louise talked a lot about syllables. Actually, both Louisa and Louise talked a lot about syllables. And this is an activity called Syllable Inspectors. And the Syllable Inspectors gets our kids to really look closely at what they see in words in order to read syllables effectively. And also to be listening to the sounds of those syllables, right? The vowel sounds in those words, because that's the key to being able to read the syllable types fluently and accurately. As I wrap up today, I want to reiterate a couple things that I think we've talked a lot about. But this quote, I think, does a nice job of explaining the work that we do, talking about teaching as one of the most cognitively complex professions. There's still uncertainty as to what works in various schools, depending on their diversity, their population. what works with each unique group of students. What makes teaching a profession is the continual inquiry, the expansion of our repertoire as teachers, and the accumulation of knowledge through our practice. I have lots of references here and even more that you can look at on our website. And I thank you all for listening, hanging in for the duration, and I hope to be able to answer some of your questions.
You will, Margie, I'm sure of it. We're going to get some of the questions that have been persistent through the day. So I'm going to start with, and we're going to get to your questions here about all the wonderful stuff about professional development and kind of support in the schools. But you also addressed the what we should be making sure that educators are doing. So one of our viewers at home asked, what does a pacing guide look like for middle school, secondary students with characteristics of dyslexia?
What it looks like, it will depend on where they are.
That's exactly right.
Right. So unfortunately, we have many kids in middle and high school who still are reading at, first, second
Correct.
grade levels. And if that's the case, we have to go back to wherever they are. And that in terms of the continuum that Louisa and Louise talked a lot about today, in terms of their phonemic awareness, in terms of their phonics, all of those foundational skills exist on a continuum. I mentioned Jane Chall and her developmental stages of reading. It doesn't matter how old you are. If you still haven't mastered those foundational skills, you have to go back to the beginning, and that's what that pacing guide would look at. I should also mention, however, that we're never going to do that in isolation and to the exclusion of focusing on vocabulary, comprehension. Meaning is extremely important. Yeah. So what makes it challenging to work with older students is that you have to do both, and you have to find ways to embed that foundational knowledge in content wherever and however you can. Teaching older students how to read multisyllabic words so they can be reading words that are associated with content. Building their background knowledge whenever and however you can. Working on writing while they're developing those foundational skills, writing at the level that they can through structured dictations, etc. So it's challenging, but it can be done. We've all seen it happen, and it's inspiring when it can and does.
So that leads into our next question that was earlier in the day, but again, I've been holding these for later. How do we teach these foundational skills to high school students without them feeling like they're treated like little children?
It's such an important question. I mean, I think there are teachers who love teaching older students, and they're the ones who do an amazing job. They find ways to engage their students. They find material that their students will be willing to read. They use graphic novels. They use whatever they can to get the job done, because there's no roadmap on this one. It really has to be driven to a large extent by their desire, their motivation, and there's lots of great work. John Guthrie's work at the University of Maryland talks about motivation. And I think special ed teachers who've worked with kids who struggle, especially at the secondary levels, are masterful at figuring out how to engage students. Great question, really important question. Finding materials that are, like I said, not geared for elementary students, geared for older students.
Yeah, and you use some graphic novels, and others would be some good examples, and then feeding them things that they can thrive on would be helpful. That is still really tricky, and as I heard that answer, I was also thinking about another level. So, and Barbara Wilson well as well. And when I think about her recommendations when she's working with older students, she often talks about acknowledging that they are developmentally in a different place as far as their thinking and their metacognitive thinking. So explaining what they're doing and why they're doing it and how it'll help them is always important, even for my second graders when I would work with them, and for the young kids that we work with. But it's so powerful for the older kids. The other thing that I've seen implemented in various settings, I've only seen this used limited in a public school setting, but often in the highly successful LD private schools, some of which have actually helped to sponsor this program, is to appreciating the fact that they are learning language. And if you want to be college bound, or if you want to think about complex things, linguistics is a very complex thing. And in a way, we are teaching them the structure of the language, which is in essence linguistics. And to talk about how that advanced work that we would learn to do from Marcia Henry, for example, on that morphological structure in Latin and Greek, which will be showing up in their disciplinary context, when we can get to those pieces, will be so powerful to them. And it would help them realize that, just like my little second grader, when I was talking to Louisa earlier, she knew the real words for a macron and a breve. They will understand that those pieces in the biology words that they're learning, like photosynthesis, have components to them that have meaning, and it'll help to elevate them and empower them, and it might give them something to feel like it isn't just dummy stuff or little kid stuff. I'm actually learning complex stuff that my other friends can't declare that they know and they don't have a knowledge for. So that's the one counterpart that I compliment to what you said too, which is the instructional materials are very critical, and I often hear people talk about those materials as being not appropriate for the age. I also think that if you explain to them the value of what they're learning and that they're building blocks in our language to get to something, and they're actually learning something very complex. I'm a cognitive scientist, so I teach undergraduates linguistics in cognitive psych classes and in graduate courses, and we do pieces like that that are advanced. And as your research has shown, Margie's and Louise's and Susan Brady and others, my own, oftentimes college-educated people who go off to teach the language that we want them to read don't have this knowledge either. So they even know some things that sometimes a lot of the teachers don't. And morphology in particular, we always find in the research literature that that's one of the weakest areas.
Yeah, just to add a couple things that you mentioned, Diana Hanbury King's English Isn't Crazy. When I worked with dyslexic students, they loved learning the history of language, and that's a great resource to explain that English isn't crazy. It's actually regular, but to your point, Tim, teaching them morphology is really important part of helping them understand the layers of language. And then the other thing that I've used a lot is this tool called the MARSI, M-A-R-S-I. It's the Meta-Linguistic Awareness of Reading Strategies for Instruction, or something to that effect.
Someone in the world right now is looking that up and putting it in a Google Docs somewhere.
Yes, and you can get it for free online, and we actually encourage our older students to engage in this survey so they understand what strategies they use when they read, and it focuses their understanding about themselves as readers. And it's really important as students get older to engage in how are they learning, what does metacognition even mean, why is it important, etc.
Yeah, and the one other thing that I think I would just add to complement what you and I both have shared is that the work from the Institutes of Educational Science in the United States that has been reviewed in meta-analysis continues to show it's never too late. So the meta-analyses from Sharon Vaughn and Jeanine Wanzak and others keeps demonstrating that there are effective practices to teach these types of foundational skills, and we can give these kids the needs that they have. We also know from that if you wind up, and the research recommendation that you'll hear Vaughn and others share is, if they've made it to middle school and they're still struggling, it's kind of time to go straight to Tier 3, which in Tennessee, for example, we've got a sanity check, which is if you're 2 years behind, you go straight to Tier 3 and then you're going to move in. So it's not time to play around with Tier 2 at that point, is one of the research recommendations. And that was made very loud and clear by several different pieces. I don't think I'd go on a limb to say that Doug and Lynn Fuchs might also agree with that. And I can't think of the citation quite off the top of my head, but I know that Sharon Vaughn has definitely said that in writing in peer-reviewed research journals. So let's get on to another one. So I think we've, how can we best meet the needs of secondary students who have only recently been diagnosed with dyslexia? We've acknowledged that. We've done that. Okay. Now we're on to your stuff, which that was definitely your stuff. How do you find out if there are mentors available in your area to come and help your school?
Those of you who know me know that I am a positive person who sees silver linings. And in the last few weeks, I think all of our positive attitudes have been challenged through what we've been experiencing. But what I really believe is happening for us as a group, as a organization, is my team and I have continued to work on exploring how to provide professional development opportunities for teachers who don't have access to the mentors that we have. For example, how can we do virtual coaching for teachers? Because I mean, we've been out to Montana, we've been to California, we've been to Oregon. We've done some work in other states, and we love doing that work and are happy to engage whenever we can. But how do you give substantive experiences that I just described in lieu of face-to-face coaching? And we're finding out how to do that. It's not that it hasn't been done. Patricia Mathis has done some research.
You and I have talked, I've talked and worked with Patricia on this in the past, and she's had scale-up funding from the Department of Ed to actually look at this. In her randomized controlled trials, we know from her research that virtual coaching can actually be more effective than face-to-face, and it will take some follow-up studies with experimentation to find what that is. But Patricia and I have talked about some hypotheses that we have, and we really think the video component, where we have to videotape ourselves, and then we have to view ourselves and rate ourselves, that important kind of observational piece to give us that real-time feedback, that mirror to look at, allows us to overcome some of our human biases and part of our decision-making. But yeah, we've talked about that, and you've wanted to reach out to SMU to find out who's still working to support that there. But yeah, I mean, and what came out of that was the Hoot platform, for example, and there's more work than any of us can do. So there's Literacy How, there's other groups that are doing this. I know that the AIM Pathways model is a piece that we've been studying empirically with randomized controlled trials, and it definitely boosts teacher knowledge that we were talking about earlier, and you can add in coaching pieces to that. So I think a lot of people are thinking about that. I think about it from a scale standpoint. The need is so great across the nation and probably the world, and there's so limited knowledge base to share, and we have to get up to speed pretty quick. So I think we're going to have to use technology as a leveraging agent to improve our efforts in these areas.
Can I just make one other comment, though? I agree with everything you just said.
Uh-oh, where's the but?
No, there's not a but, really. It's just that I think that the question that the person asked had to do with finding qualified people to do some of this coaching. And I think that's an important question because there are coaches in schools. We find them all the time. Here's the problem.
Yeah, that's right.
90% of the time, they're not actually coaching. I alluded to that a little while ago. And why aren't they? Because they're not comfortable seen as, maybe evaluating their peers or telling their peers what to do. They tell us this all the time. Well, we don't feel comfortable going into teachers' classrooms actually coaching them. They're happy to help them in many ways. That's not the issue. It's just that they don't really see themselves as coaches. And so that role has to be defined. And we've been working with our districts closely to say, if you have coaches, you need to make sure that there is an expectation on everyone's part that this is what the role of the coach should be.
So there's two levels to that then, and because you're right, you're directing us back to the question. One is, where would you find them as if they were like free agents? I will say that I don't know if there's like a huge pile of people out there that are qualified to do this work. I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that. I don't know if I'm wrong. And, Twitter can scream at me if I am wrong. Secondly, I was in an implementation meeting about a month and a half ago before all the travels kind of started coming in. And I remember talking about that. I said, your coaches, and, that you say you're not effective and your state's not effective, you've adopted new curriculum since they were in the classroom. Did they even know how to implement, and have they ever really been with students to implement that program? Because I can take and work with my staff because I've implemented the instruments that we've used to do diagnostics. I've done these things. I've used the curriculum that we use in the center. Dr. Hirschman's smiling because she walked in on me one day and I had started doing the introductions to a lesson once because she got held up in the dean's office. So I would actually feel that it's not just for street cred that we need to be actually practicing what we preach, but I do believe that one of the limitations is that if you haven't been in the classroom for very long, how can you? And I remember in that implementation meeting, I'd been paraded to 8 different schools, and I said, I saw a lot of classroom instruction, but I'm not quite as comfortable. But I saw a lot of one-on-one and small group, and that's what I'm certified to do, and that's what I help to do in my center, and that's what I support in my center. I feel very comfortable there. But if you want to hear about classroom teachers, I'm not your person for that. But I can definitely give you constructive feedback about what I saw in those settings that I still feel comfortable doing myself and have been validated through practicum experience and demonstration of my skills and making kids read that I can do. And I think that's an important conversation to have about how do we support at certain levels. So Penny Schwinn, if you're listening, or your team, how do you make sure that the coaches in our schools in Tennessee, Vicki King and Stacy Smith, how do you make sure the coaches in your schools in Arkansas, anybody out there that's listening, how do you make sure your coaches and what procedures and policies and plans for what you should look like based on what qualifications they should have and how they keep them up? Because in Tennessee, we're adopting new curriculums. Who in the schools even know how to use them? And who's going to coach them? The Reading First study failed for coaches because they got 2 extra hours of coaching. It wasn't because coaching isn't important, as you demonstrated with your data. But when they did that study, and they did the Reading First study, they only got a little bit extra training. How do you do a little bit of extra training and then go and actually supervise and implement instructional strategies to improve and elevate and support teachers? I'm on my soapbox. I'll lead off of it.
No, it's true. And what I said earlier about schools adopting programs, if they're doing that and expecting teachers to engage in substantive coaching experiences,
correct,
apart from implementing a program with fidelity, it's really hard to do both. In fact, in some cases, sometimes people think that we're part of a core reading program implementation.
Right.
That we work for, Houghton Mifflin or whatever. And
right.
They don't, and we often say we're kind of agnostic when it comes to programs because we have to be. We have to show teachers how to use their knowledge to get the right result.
I would say that since we are doing this third leg, which is related to this question, which we're taking a long time on, but I love this dialogue, is I think that using technology in different ways, like we see in the evidence-based practices in scaled up controlled trials of like the A2I platform, we're using ongoing instruction. And what that model is it goes in and it takes a core curriculum that's been adopted, finds where its holes are to address the science of reading, fills those holes, and then through continual teaching and differentiation, they reduce the referrals to SPED in randomized controlled trials because they elevate the differentiated instruction by helping teachers know how to use those data and know what instructional dosage they should give to their kids each day they walk in the door. And that's a slightly different. So to the extent that through the facilitation of being helped with using a curriculum, and technology can play a role there too.
Definitely.
I think we've really taken this question and went way over here. The sad thing is that if you're looking for coaches, I do think you should try to find effective, proven people, and who, when you listen to them, you think that there's substance to what they're saying. That if you push them, you fill. It should be a job interview, and you should know if you press them that they've got answers to the questions that you have, and that it passes your sanity check on what you would hope to have them say. And I guess, and you want to do a plug? Is Literacy How looking for places to help implement coaching, or anybody else want to shout on in chats? You can do that. But
as I said before, we don't have enough mentors, but we're always looking for ways to build a model so that we can guide other people who are doing this work. And that's something that we're engaging in right now. We've been given the gift of being able to work on this right now while we're out of schools for the next, bit of time. And it is a gift because I think that mapping this process out is going to serve other people well. And where we have research to point to exactly how to do that, we will certainly do that. And where we don't, as you know, Tim, I've been wanting to do that research study. With me,
I know we will do it. We're going to do that. What I hear you say is that, and I know this is true of you, and I know this is true of another nonprofit, the Learning Alliance down in Florida, and they're looking at kind of these franchise approaches, which is there's other not-for-profits that are out in communities or groups or agencies that are looking for guidance in how they can actually implement something and learn from what you've done. And I know others are thinking along this way too, and trying to take the years of experience that they have in their models and try to expand them to build capacity in that way, in kind of a sharing way. And that's kind of an interesting viral approach to trying to do. Wrong word in the moment. I apologize out there to the interwebs. So how can we incentivize the process of coaching and altering instructional practices?
Well, that's the essence of the work that we do, because as I mentioned earlier, we cannot evaluate teachers, and we cannot be seen as being evaluative or judgmental. At the same time, what we're trying to do is work with administrators, as I mentioned a couple of times, so that we can build their knowledge and that they in turn can see what they need to, to know what to look for when they're basically evaluating what's happening in the classroom.
Yeah.
And they're not, most of them are either not able to do that in substantive ways, or they don't take the time to do it because they're doing so many other things.
Right.
I don't know how we can hold teachers accountable for making sure that they are applying the science of reading any other way, really.
Yeah.
And so it's really got to be a team approach where we are seen as knowledgeable people who want to just help teachers learn this content without judging. And those relationship building is the key element. Why the virtual coaching is a little challenging, because how do you establish that kind of relationship through technology? I know it can be done. I think it's a little more challenging to do it. But going back to your question about incentivizing people, I think you have to inspire them by looking at their data all the time, by showing them when they're applying this is what's happening for kids, because most teachers dearly want to make sure that their kids are being successful, and continuing to impress upon them that this is a process that takes a lot of time and they have to sort of be in it for the long haul.
They do. That's actually interesting, because I wanted to follow up, because there's another level to this, that you're right there with the classrooms and kind of at that coach level. I know that both at state work and the work that I've helped and I've seen evolve in Mississippi as well as in Arkansas, and I'm really hopeful that we'll get here, is that the support and the commitment to the new practices and the new initiative goes all the way to the top, and they don't waver on it. And that's really important, because I are associated with higher ed, and we all know that we learn really early on in the tenure process from the senior faculty that if you keep your head down, you don't make too much noise, the next administrator will be along and they'll be the next thing that they care about. The next graduate dean, the next dean of something, the next president. My university's had the same president for a whole long time, and that gives us a lot of stability. I've had the same dean for a long time, and I really value that. But we know that, and we hear that from our educators in the classrooms, and we hear it from the building principals too, that we know that superintendent's shelf life aren't very long. So It does think that we need to have a conversation at a higher leadership level about how we sustain and stop the revolving doors, so that we can build credibility to know that if they stick their necks out to commit to something, that they will be supported and elevated and given the tools that they need and the training that they need. And I'm being told like about 2 minutes, Margie. So if you want to comment on that.
That's so important. One of the districts that I will not name by name, but those teachers who might be listening know who they are. They have an incredible group of leaders, and they've stayed in the district for a length of time, and they've moved up into those positions where they have more power to make important decisions, and they've entrusted us with this very important job of building the teacher's knowledge. Yeah. And we've seen great, results because of it. So your point is well taken. People have to know that this is going to take a sustained effort over time to change.
And that seems like from the very first thing that Louisa and I talked about this morning was that we advocate for kind of a slower roll. And I know that frustrates parents and advocates out there, but we don't want this to be the next fad. We don't want this to be the craze that goes away. We want people to come to an understanding on their own that there is value to this and convince themselves of it through coming to a deeper level of understanding of what we need to be doing. And I think that's a way that you could build change that's effortful and deliberate, but we often work on that fast decisions process too. And the work of the book Blink comes to mind from the work of Kahneman and Tversky, for example.
Yes.
So we're going to wrap up here. I think everybody's learned throughout the day. With my friends, I can talk all day. So we'll shake a tail to Love Shack in the future, my friend. And thank you so much for this. This has been delightful. We have had a great day. I hope you have too. And we're going to wrap this up. We appreciate you being with us. We appreciate all your comments and your positivity and your help of others out there in the world to resolve their user end problems on their end, for being understanding that with a skeleton crew here that's working after this university has basically been shut down and we've been all told to work from home. We are doing this to bring this to you because we know that educators and parents are hungry to learn about this, make your own decisions, and find out how we can elevate all students so that we can help even the ones that are most disadvantaged, which I started the day off with. So thank you for this, and Godspeed, and be safe, and I hope that you and your families are well.